Tuesday, Biden declared war on the Netanyahu government. Our soldiers continue to pay the price. What's next? What's the future for U.S.-Israel relations? I'll have all of the details coming up on In Focus. Tuesday night, President Biden gave a speech at a fundraiser held for him by former AIPAC President Lee Rosenberg, also DNC operative, I think. And he used the opportunity in speaking before a liberal Jewish audience to essentially open up a war against the Netanyahu government. I think it's really important to go through all of the things that Biden did in this speech in order to understand just how horrific his new position, or his entirely now elucidated position on Israel and on the war with Hamas and our other enemies in the area has become for the state of Israel and for the future of U.S.-Israel relations. So there are a lot of different write-ups of the speech. I'm using one from the Times of Israel just as an annotation to go through precisely what he said. So first of all, Biden went after Prime Minister Netanyahu. As he often does, he said that Netanyahu is, quote, a good friend, but I think he has to change. This government in Israel is making it very difficult for him to move, Biden said. And he specifically went after, not for the first time, for the second time, National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's the head of the Jewish Power Party, and he's in charge of the police. And this is the second time that Biden went after Itamar Ben-Gvir, and intimated as well that the head of the religious Zionism party, Bezalel Smotrich, and Itamar Ben-Gvir and their parties have to be removed from the government. This is what he said. He criticized National Security Minister Ben-Gvir by name. He said, this is the most conservative government in Israel's history. That's what he said at the height of the left's anti-government insurgency, which we'll get to in a second. He said the same thing. And then he said of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, he said, they not only want to have retribution, which they should, for what Hamas did, but against all Palestinians. They don't want anything to do with the Palestinians. And then he reiterated the U.S. stance that Hamas does not represent all Palestinians, and that not all of Gaza should suffer because of the terror group's brutal October 7th attack on Israel. Okay, so we already know that this is pure garbage. I mean, the Palestinians overwhelmingly support Hamas. 3/4 of them support Hamas, not only in Gaza, but in Judea and Samaria, which is controlled by the Palestinian Authority, which the United States funds and arms and trains. They all support Hamas. 3/4 of them. 86%, by the way, in Judea and Samaria. Fewer in Gaza because they've had to pay the price for Hamas's monstrous assault on Israel on their own backs, but still over 60% of Palestinians living in Gaza support Hamas, support the slaughter of October 7th, and support the annihilation of Israel, which is Hamas's goal and the Palestinians' goal, the Palestinian Authority's goal. So we're talking about him saying that Hamas does not represent the Palestinians when it does. And then he says that there's something wrong with retribution, or that the fact that Israel is prosecuting this war is some sort of a revenge match, when, of course, it's not. And it's ignoring the strategic imperative of this war to make ignorant statements like this. Because what we saw on October 7th, and I say this not for the first or second or 10th time, what we saw on October 7th is that Israel cannot continue to live with a terror regime at its doorstep. It's too dangerous. We see that when they say that their aspiration is the annihilation of Israel and the annihilation of the Jewish people throughout the world, they mean it. We saw that very clearly on October 7th, and we have to act on that horrific experience today. if Hamas is, and by the way, it's not just Israel that saw it, the entire world saw it. The entire world saw the atrocities that they committed and continue to commit in Gaza against the remaining hostages, the 136 hostages that remain in Hamas custody. It's not just that we saw it, the entire world saw it. And the entire world understands, just as Israel does, that we have to eradicate Hamas. And to the extent that Israel fails to do so, the entire world, including all of our neighbors, both our friends and our enemies here in the region, will see that Israel can't even do that, which means that if Israel doesn't eradicate Hamas in Gaza today, then we're going to face further aggression from our additional enemies in the region that are controlled today largely by Iran. And we're also going to see that our partners in the region are going to be second guessing whether it's a good idea to remain our partners, because we'll have shown that we don't have what it takes in order to remove this kind of threat from our midst. So by saying that this is a revenge thing, the Biden administration, President Biden, first and foremost, is ignoring the strategic imperative of what Israel is doing. And that, I think, is one of the big problems here. He then said, he explained that his desire to oust, to really overturn the results of the November 1st, 2022 elections by saying that two of Netanyahu's organic coalition partners, the Religious Zionism Party and the Jewish Power Party, are illegitimate political actors. He says that this has to be done in order to advance his goal of establishing a Palestinian state. And he threatened not only the government, but he threatened American support for Israel. He also threatened future normalization between Israel and its neighbors in the Middle East. He said here, and here he spoke to the most important aspect of that has been revealed to date, which is that there's a plan, a U.S. plan to develop a rail line that transfers goods that are imported to Saudi Arabia from India through Saudi Arabia. The railroad will go through Saudi Arabia, through Jordan, into Israel, and then leave the Middle East, leave from Israel, from the port of Haifa, to go to Europe, and that is a project that will completely end any sort of separation between Israel and the region, because it will put a geographic and economic link between Israel and Saudi Arabia, effectively normalizing relations between the two countries, even if we never sign anything. That deal itself leads to Israel's full integration into the region. And so he's saying here that may be in danger. Nice normalization plan you got there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. He said here that there remains, quote, an opportunity to begin to unite the region with this deal. They still want to do it, but we have to make sure that Bibi understands that he's got to make some moves to strengthen the Palestinian Authority. You cannot say there's no Palestinian state at all in the future. So Biden here is threatening to scupper plans to normalize regional peace, because what is most important to him is establishing a Palestinian state. And here I just want to make 2 points about this, right? The first one is that anybody with eyes in his head, particularly after October 7th, but really it's been cleared since the Palestinians, for instance, the U.S.-supported, U.S.-financed, U.S.-armed, U.S.-trained Palestinian security services and the Palestinian Authority that they serve rejected peace, rejected a two-state solution at Camp David in July 2000, and opened a massive, unprecedented in scale until October 7th, terror onslaught against Israel that lasted for years, and saw even more Israelis cumulatively killed in that terror war than were killed on October 7th. Okay, so that already dispelled the notion that a Palestinian state that would live at peace with Israel was a possibility for most Israelis. But it never dispelled the fantasy of U.S. policymakers that this is supposed to be the goal of U.S. foreign policy. So that since September, say, when they opened their terror war against Israel of 2000 until December of 2023, successive U.S. governments have rejected reality as the basis for their Middle East policy making and maintain their slavish allegiance to the idea that the most important thing to do, the most urgent thing to do in the Middle East is to form a Palestinian state, even though there has never been any evidence in the intervening 23 years that there is any faction in Palestinian society that is willing to live at peace with Israel. So U.S. policy is based entirely on devotion to an idea that has been proven wrong repeatedly, at least over the past 23 years. And I would argue, as somebody who was a member of Israel's negotiating team with the Palestinians in the 1990s, at the height of the fake peace process, that there was never any chance that there would be a Palestinian state at the end of the road that would live at peace with Israel, because the Palestinians never abided by their commitments to Israel throughout those years of peace. Instead, at the same time that the Palestinian Authority was being formed, Israel was introduced for the first time in our history to suicide bombers in our urban centers. Okay, it was the exact same time, April, May 1994, when we had our first suicide attack and when we had the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. So there was never any chance that it would have worked, but certainly anybody with eyes in his head should have recognized that in September of 2000. But the U.S. has refused. And now now President Biden on Tuesday made the position explicit. The U.S. opposes regional peace between Israel and the Arabs, opposes the end of the Arab-Israel conflict if it comes without the establishment of a Palestinian terror state in Israel's midst, that everybody knows, particularly after October 7th, and the jubilation that act of genocide, those acts of genocide has been greeted on the Palestinian street throughout Palestinian society. Again, 3/4 of Palestinians support what happened on October 7th, support the slaughter, support the genocide of Jews, right? The United States is now saying openly, the President of the United States, that the President of the United States and his government oppose the end of the Arab-Israel conflict so long as it doesn't involve the establishment of a Palestinian terror state in Israel's heartland and doesn't involve Israel transferring Gaza in a post-war period to the Palestinian terrorists who were directly involved in the slaughter and have refused to condemn the slaughter since October 7th. Don't forget, we spoke about this, I think, a couple of weeks ago. Fatah terrorists who are paid by the Palestinian Authority every month, and the U.S. underwrites their salaries, participated in the slaughter in October 7th. They also, to the side of Hamas terrorists, invaded Israeli territory, killed Israeli civilians, kidnapped Israeli civilians to Gaza, raped Israeli women. Fatah terrorists then posted their actions on their Telegram pages to show the world that they too were involved in this massacre of Israelis, okay? So the United States wants Israel to accept America's goal of transferring Gaza to these terrorists in a post-war period so that they, on the backs of our soldiers, will maintain Gaza's identity as an enemy enclave run by terrorists that will, at every opportunity, continue to attack Israel and kill our people. Okay, that is the goal that the Biden administration is advancing. And to that end, Biden is now taking aim at the stability of the elected Israeli government and delegitimizing and demonizing its senior ministers, as well as the prime minister, who he blames and calls weak for not standing up to his ministers who share his goal of opposing the establishment of such a terror state. Okay? And he said it again explicitly of the new Israeli government that he once formed. Quote, "We have to work towards bringing Israel together in a way that provides for the beginning of a two-state solution." So we have to undermine, subvert, and cancel the votes of the Israeli people and bring about a government that they rejected explicitly just a year ago, right? And those sentiments have hardened extensively since October 7th. They are shared now by elements of the political left, large elements of the political left, who were the primary victims of the slaughter on October 7th. You hear formerly far-left members of the kibbutzim that were the victims of the slaughter saying that they cannot go back to their homes until the Palestinian until Hamas is completely wiped out, and that they oppose the establishment of a Palestinian state and expect Israel to continue to control Gaza. These are people who are on the far left. How they will vote in the next election depends on how the so-called left-wing parties that they supported position themselves. My expectation is that those parties, in order to maintain the support of their voters, will move very far to the right, farther than they've been since the early 1990s. Okay? But here is Biden saying that the goal of U.S. policy regarding Israel is to overthrow the government and coerce the Israeli people to accept a government that will advance the U.S. goal they oppose of establishing a terrorist state in Judea and Samaria and Gaza, led by terrorists who were also engaged and continued to support the slaughter of October 7th. And here, I think it's very important to note, just a few days ago, sort of the generalissimo of the insurgency that Israel experienced in the months leading up to the October 7th invasion, Ehud Barak, the former prime minister and defense minister, held a Zoom conversation with his partners in the insurgency. And he gave them their marching orders. He said that they have to reinstate the anti-government campaign that was interrupted by October 7th and do so at the height of the war. And he explained to them, Barak did, that in order to do this, they have to hide the fact that they're the same people that were behind the anti-government insurgency beforehand. He said, I can't appear in the rallies. Shikma Bressler can't appear in the rallies. She's sort of the generalissima. She was the appassionara of the insurgency. Her husband, by the way, is a senior officer in the Shin Bet whose colossal failure on October 7th, in the months and years leading up to October 7th, his utter inability, apparently, to find informants inside of Gaza contributed perhaps the greatest contribution to Israel's intelligence failure that led to us being blind on the morning of October 7th. Anyway, Shikma Bressler said, and he and former defense minister Moshe Ya'alon, he said, should not be featured speakers at the rallies. Rather, they should hide behind the families of the hostages who have been mobilized by one of the PR executives who was a central force in the insurgency, a man named Ronen Sur, and he said that we should make this about the hostages and use the hostage issue as a means to bring Israelis who oppose the political character of the anti-Netanyahu campaign of pre-October 7th Israel to participate in them so that they can have mass rallies calling for Netanyahu's overthrow. And what's interesting here is that Ehud Barak also said, he talked about the participation of Benny Gantz's party in the war cabinet on an emergency basis, right? With Benny Gantz as a voting member in the war cabinet, former defense minister and former IDF chief of staff Benny Gantz, former IDF chief of staff Gadi Eisenkot, that he was explaining when they should leave. And he said that they should leave the war cabinet and destabilize the government when there's an open clash between the government and the U.S. government, which is obviously where we're going right now as a result of Biden's speech. He also said that before they leave, they have to cause Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and their parties to leave the coalition, because by doing that, then they ensure that Netanyahu will fall. Because, of course, Netanyahu, before Gantz and his partners came in, had a stable 64-member ruling coalition in Israel's 120-member Knesset. So what he wants to do is take out 10 members of that coalition, the Ben-Gvir and Smotrich parties, and then Netanyahu will be left with a coalition of 56 people. And then if Benny Gantz's party leaves, then it'll be possible to overthrow Netanyahu in a Knesset vote. So that's what Barak foresees, is that first they're going to force Ben-Gvir and Smotrich out, and then Benny Gantz and his party will leave once the United States opens an open front against Israel, and which we saw Biden do on Tuesday night at the home of the former AIPAC chairman Lee Rosenberg. So So this, you want to say it's not coordinated? Well, let's read what else Biden said. Biden went on to suggest that the domestic pressure could cause Netanyahu to move in the direction of two states, noting the protests earlier this year that managed to thwart parts of the judicial overhaul being advanced by his government. Here's the quote. You saw what happened when Bibi tried to change the Supreme Court. Thousands of IDF soldiers said, we're out. We're not going to participate. We're not going to support the military. So this is what he's suggesting may happen in the middle of a war. Okay, so again, nice army you got there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. And here I am in the middle of a war threatening that that's what's going to happen if Netanyahu doesn't get smart and tear apart his governing coalition and bring in left-wing elements in order to advance a policy of national suicide by the establishment of a terror state in Israel's heartland and the transfer of a post-war Gaza to the same terrorists, right? Who, by the way, the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh said last week that he wants to form a coalition with Hamas after the war. So there you have it. I mean, this is America's policy to support these people and to threaten the Israeli government, which is actually a democracy, if Israel doesn't abide by his threats. And then he said, but of course, just so we're clear, right? He's not involved in any of this. He said that there wasn't any outside influence in the pre-October 7th anti-government insurrection. He says, that wasn't any outside influence. That came from within Israel. Yeah, we didn't have anything to do with it. Then, the part that everybody likes to quote, the part where he says that he's foursquare behind Israel. And this is also important. We'll get to that in a second, but let's just go through the quote. He says, Israel has a tough decision to make. Bibi has a tough decision to make. There is no question about the need to take on Hamas. None. Zero. They have every right. And he acknowledges that Israel currently faces an existential threat. And he says, we're not going to do a damn thing other than protect Israel and ensure they have what they need to defend themselves and to finish the job against Hamas. But Israel has to defend civilians too, because obviously, as he said, the civilians in Gaza who support Hamas don't support Hamas, and therefore you can't go after them. So what civilians is Israel not going after right now? There have been a lot of analyses written by different people. I've spoken about it here on Israeli television, as have others, about the steps that Israel is required to make by the Biden administration in order to avoid civilian casualties. So one of the things that's come out, and I think Ron Ben Ishai wrote about it in Ynet, is that you have what are they called? Like advanced siders who Hamas employs women who look like civilians to communicate to Hamas where IDF forces are and when they're by a building that's booby-trapped, so that Hamas terrorists who are not being seen, who are not seen, are able to detonate booby traps that were placed there ahead of time. Okay, so one of the groups of people Israel isn't allowed to go after is females who are civilians in the middle of a war zone, because if you do that, then you'll be accused of a war crime of killing uninvolved civilians, even though these women are used by Hamas as warriors. Their job is to be siders who can then tell Hamas where our soldiers are. So that's one of the groups of people. Others are, say, unarmed men who are on rooftops with walkie-talkies. Well, they're not combatants either, right? They just happen to be standing on a roof. I mean, wouldn't you if you were in the middle of a battle and overseeing it? Because those are the other siders that are used to then detonate booby-trapped homes while IDF forces are inside of them. Right? And Israel can't aerial bomb a lot of these buildings because the Biden administration has said explicitly that it opposes the wanton destruction of property. Secretary of State Blinken repeated this in front of the cameras when he was here last time in Israel. He said, they expect the United States, as we continue our operations at the end of the ceasefire, when Hamas refused to adhere to the ceasefire and release the rest of the women. We have 17 women, young women, who Hamas continues to hold in Gaza. When Hamas refused to adhere to the terms of the ceasefire in Israel and actually opened fire on Israel with its missiles and attacking on our forces on the ground in Gaza. And so Israel reinstated its own operations. Blinken said, okay, fine, but you're not allowed to cause any destruction that might harm civilians in Gaza. And then they started putting in more restrictions and more demands for more so-called humanitarian aid to come in explicitly, right? So we're now in a situation where all of these things that endanger our military operations and all of these supplies that endanger our military operations and our soldiers are being demanded by the United States in order to maintain American support. And just a couple more things on that. So continuing on Biden's speech, he compared the war in Gaza, which is, again, bordering Israel. Israel was invaded from Gaza on October 7th. He compares it to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And here it's worth quoting. The U.S. president recalled how, during one of their many conversations since October 7th, Netanyahu sought to justify the deaths of civilians in Gaza by recalling how many died in the U.S. response to the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. Quote, he says, this is a quote from Biden, "You carpet bombed Germany, you dropped the atomic bomb, a lot of civilians died." Biden quoted Netanyahu as having said, "I said, yeah. That's why all these institutions were set up after World War II to see that it didn't happen again." Then he goes on. Of course, the United States did the same thing in Iraq and in Afghanistan, but whatever. And we stood by them always because A, we're an ally, and B, we understand that terrorists who operate deliberately among civilians are responsible for the civilian deaths they cause, not you who are fighting them in a just war. But then he says, don't make the same mistakes we made after 9/11. There was no reason we had to be in a war in Afghanistan after 9/11. There was no reason why we had to do some of the things we did. All evidence to the contrary, the United States was attacked on 9/11 by Al-Qaeda, which was in Afghanistan. There are many things that the United States did wrong after 9/11, and we can go through that one day if necessary, but there's no reason to call into question the necessity of the United States going in and destroying the Taliban and destroying Al-Qaeda after 9/11. That was completely justified and correct. Imagine if Osama bin Laden had been able to continue to operate openly in Afghanistan after the single worst day of carnage in U.S. history, right? No. But he says, don't make the same mistake. And again, Afghanistan is located, 7,000, 8,000 miles from the United States. And here we're not even talking about 7 miles. We're talking about adjacent to our communities, less than a kilometer away from the fields of Nahal Oz. All right? This is a joke. These are our neighbors. They invaded our territory, and he is conflating our war. He's comparing it to U.S. wars in distant lands. They don't get it. There's no comparison between the two wars. It's totally different. It would have been as if it would have been precisely the situation if Mexico or Canada was controlled by jihadists sworn to the annihilation of the United States and then proceeded, after years and years and years of indiscriminate missile attacks against the United States, they invaded U.S. territory and began slaughtering Americans on border communities as part of their declared war to annihilate the United States and to annihilate the people of the United States. That's what happened on October 7th. And here is this insane, cruel comparison to Afghanistan. Why? Because they're all Muslims? What's the connection? There's no connection. And then he threatens U.S. support for Israel. We're going to stop our support for Israel. And here we're getting, of course, to the scenario that Ehud Barak laid out in his new plan for ousting the government, for overthrowing the government in the middle of the war. Says, one of the things that Bibi understands, but I'm not sure Ben-Gvir and his war cabinet do, is that Israel's security can rest on the United States. It can, but right now it has more than the United States. It has the European Union and most of the world supporting it. Then, by the way, why did France vote against Israel repeatedly at the UN Security Council? Why is Britain abstaining? But whatever. Then he said, but they're starting to lose that support by the indiscriminate bombing that takes place. Okay, there's never been any indiscriminate bombing. It's total, complete, and utter lie. There is no indiscriminate bombing in Gaza. None. No indiscriminate bombing. Israel chooses its targets just in a discriminating manner. We go after targets where we know that there are terrorists located. That's why we attack them, because they manifest a threat to our forces and to our war goals, okay, of eradicating Hamas. So this is just a libel. And all of these American gaslighting statements saying we expect Israel to uphold the laws of war, even though Israel always upholds the laws of war, is just a slander. It's just a slander. And based on the slander, he threatens the continued American support for Israel in the middle of this war. Okay. And now another aspect to that, of course, is that we face this constant flow of senior administration officials here to bark orders at us. Tomorrow, on Thursday, we're going to have Jake Sullivan here. Jake Sullivan gave us marching orders ahead of this visit. I expect you to open Kerem Shalom crossing point to Gaza for inspections of our humanitarian aid before I arrive. Okay, this little pipsqueak is telling Israel that we have to allow all of this stuff to be checked. Well, we've already found out, and we have photographic evidence that's running around all over the internet showing Hamas terrorists seizing, why not, all of these humanitarian aid trucks and barring Gazan civilians, right, who all support them, but whatever, from having any food, okay? And they're taking it all to them. Can we have any question but that Hamas would have long have been defeated weeks ago if it didn't have fuel and it didn't have medicine and it didn't have food to go on and maintain this war against us? No, there's no doubt about it. The United States is guaranteeing the resupply and the longevity of Hamas as a fighting force. And the food and the water and the fuel is going to them. And we've also found military parts inside of those humanitarian aid trucks. And we also know that Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas terror master, who's the architect of the October 7th slaughter, who is now the field commander of everything happening in Gaza Strip, including the murder of Israeli hostages we uncovered. We recovered 2 bodies of murdered Israeli hostages on Monday. We know that he moved from northern Gaza to southern Gaza, where he is now suspected of being located in a humanitarian aid truck. Okay, so the United States is facilitating Hamas's war against Israel with its continued, frankly, irrational demand and harping on Israel that we have to allow resupply. They're demanding that we resupply Hamas. This is a chief aim of the United States in its conversations with Israel. So Jake Sullivan is going to be here on Thursday to bark orders at us. And then next week, Defense Minister Lloyd Austin is going to come here and bark more orders at us. And I assume that has to do with Lebanon, where the United States is insisting that we allow Hezbollah to remain the same existential threat it poses to us today after the war, and not take any significant military undertake any significant military operations to significantly and necessarily downgrade its capacity to eradicate the state of Israel. And here, I think it's worth pointing out, we have to move to something else, which is the result of this kind of American pressure for us to curtail our military operations, our aerial bombings, the sighting of non-civilian targets who are located inside of war zones in active battle scenes. We're not allowed to go after them because they're not wearing, Hamas ID tags, right? Right. So this morning, every morning we wake up to the notification of the names of our soldiers who were killed the previous day in Gaza. I think that the IDF spokesman, their practice is to release the names of the dead at 6 o'clock in the morning. So this morning we woke up, not to a couple of names, which is usually what happens, 2, maybe 3 killed every day. No. This morning we woke up to 10, 9 of them from Golani, right? Who are they? This morning we woke up to the news that Lieutenant Colonel Tomer Greenberg was a battalion commander of the Battalion 13 of Golani. He was killed. Major Roi Meldasi, a platoon commander in Golani, was killed. Major Moshe Avram Bar from the tactical rescue squad of the Air Force, also a company commander, he was killed. Sergeant Achia Daskel, 19, was killed. Captain Liel Chayu, who was the one underneath a company, he was killed. Squad commander, he was killed. Major Ben Shelley, another squad commander, he was killed. Sergeant First Class Rom Hecht was killed. Staff Sergeant Oria Yaakov was killed. And then Colonel Yitzhak Ben Basad was killed. He was just about to leave the army, and on October 7th, he just said, I'm here, and he joined Golani in this operation. He was 44. He was killed. Sergeant Eran Aloni, 19, from Ofakim, he was killed. All of them were killed yesterday. How are they killed yesterday? Because they got stuck in a booby-trapped house. All of these apartments, all of these homes were booby-trapped during the ceasefire for the hostages for terrorist swap. Okay? And they weren't bombed from the air in large part due to U.S. pressure. So our soldiers are sent into these battle zones where you have females on the ground pointing to or exposing the presence of IDF forces so that they can remote control, blow up the booby-trapped rooms that the soldiers operate inside of to kill them, and then there was a hole in the ground to entrance to a tunnel, and so there was a great fear that the 4 that were initially killed were going to be stolen into the tunnels, and they would be used as bargaining chips, either dead or alive. We didn't know which. And so you had 3 different teams coming in to try to evacuate them, and that's where we had the rest of the dead. And we have 6 more soldiers who were wounded. Okay, and this is happening because, in large part, we've minimized our aerial bombing campaigns due to American pressure. And by the way, Biden said that he'll give us everything we need, but there's a chronic fear, a constant fear that we will not be resupplied for our Air Force, which is completely dependent on American military assistance to operate. Okay, all of the bombs for the Air Force are manufactured in the United States, and we're completely dependent on American resupply in order to continue to fly. All right, so that's the situation. So it's both the threat of non-resupply, the threat of withdrawing American diplomatic support for Israel, and this constant drumbeat of limitations on the operations that the American government is going to accept. All of this is exposing our soldiers to danger that has led to their death. Just this morning, again, we found out that 10 of them were killed. And we're supposed to take this lying down when all of us have friends and families fighting in Gaza. We know that all of us have loved ones whose lives are in danger because of this. Why? Because you want to protect Palestinian civilians who overwhelmingly support Hamas, and the civilians that are in active battle zones cannot be considered innocent civilians. They're there for a reason, and they should be killed. And the buildings that these people are operating out of, we know we're not using artillery fire as suppressing fire. We're not using the kind of smoke screens we should, because the Americans complain about everything that we're doing. Okay? Looking forward, I said that we're going to talk about the future of American-Israel relations. I've been warning, I have been raising the alarm for decades about how our strategic dependence on the United States undermines our relationship with the United States and endangers our survival, because we don't ever know on any given day who's going to win another American election. And we have a lot of friends in the United States who say, don't worry, help is on the way. Trump will be returning to office. They promise, he's leading in the polls and he's going to replace Biden, and you're going to see completely different American policy. That may be true. I have absolutely no idea. I certainly wouldn't gamble on anything, because how does anybody know? That would be significant information to have, if you want to make investments in the U.S. economy. But all the same, none of us know whether Biden's going to get a second term, whether he's going to be replaced by Michelle Obama or somebody else. We don't know. We don't know who's going to win. But the fact of the matter is that, what we do know is that Israel cannot be dependent on the United States for our survival. We can't. Doesn't matter who's in the White House at any particular moment. It's true that Obama structured a memorandum of understanding for U.S. military assistance to Israel in a manner that all but ensured that Israel's own domestic manufacturing capabilities of munitions was going to be undermined, because all of the economics told us that we should be buying our equipment, our war material, our rifles, our bullets, our artillery shells or tank shells from the United States and not manufacture them here. And really, as a result of the 2016 MOU, we closed down a lot of production lines, and now we're trying to reopen them, but we've lost a lot of people with the knowledge of how to produce these things. So it takes time, and now we're in the middle of the war, and we're facing people like Anthony Blinken. So that's one thing. The other thing is that this is not a stable, and maybe, we'll get a new MOU that doesn't place these kinds of limitations on the amount of money that we're able to use towards domestic procurement. I don't know whether that's even a possibility or not. Maybe it is. But the fact of the matter is that Israel's security interest is not served by our strategic dependence on the United States. The United States gets to look at us as a vassal state anytime it wants to. We obviously have the Hamas supporting caucus in Congress with the Squad and a lot of other people who support Hamas and want Israel to lose this war almost openly, and in fact, in some places, explicitly. So we're looking at a situation where, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and AOC get a say in whether we're going to have the means to defend ourselves, and that's something that no state that is long for this world can accept for long. And so Israel has to actually change our relationship with the United States from one of dependence into one of partnership, where we can partner with our American allies to develop new weapons and to perhaps jointly export different things that we make together. But we have to have the domestic production capacity to fight wars on our own, regardless of who is in the White House, so that we don't have a president saying, nice government you got there, Bibi. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. But by the way, if something doesn't happen to it, you're going to face a renewal of the domestic political insurgency that you faced for the year previous to the October 7th invasion and slaughter. And we're going to back that, although we will say that we have nothing to do with it, while we're clearly coordinating our positions with Ehud Barak and his cronies. So, we're facing an incredible situation here where Biden's statement on Tuesday explicitly, point by point, showed that he does not support an Israeli victory in this war, period. Israelis are starting to wake up to this reality and realize just how dangerous our strategic dependence on the United States has become for our country. And we, moving forward, have to change that relationship fundamentally. But during the course of this war, and to be clear, this is not Afghanistan. This is not Iraq. This is not a war of choice. This is not about revenge. It's about our survival. And we have to win this war in a knockout. We have to make it so clear to everybody that just as anybody in the world knew, if you went to Kentucky or you went to Kathmandu next year and you asked who won the war between Israel and Hamas, everybody will be able to say that it's Israel without hesitation. Everybody will have to understand that without question, we won. And if that doesn't happen, our very survival is at stake. There are a lot of things. Israelis are the most pro-American people on the face of the planet. No, I think the polls are number 2. We love America, but when we see this kind of behavior on the part of the Biden administration and the part of the Hamas caucus in Capitol Hill, and of course the universities and all that, we have to recognize that just like every other country in the world, if we want to survive, we can't rely on the kindness of strangers, no matter how nice they may be. And our friends in the United States have to encourage us to end our dependence on the United States and to help us take the steps that will enable us to do that as quickly as possible. Anyway, those are my thoughts for today, and I'll talk to you again next week. Take care and enjoy the rest of Hanukkah.